I was talking with a group of mentees this morning about the notion of affordances. And one of the things I want to make very clear is that this notion, if you're not familiar with it, I'll explain what I mean, but this actually goes a long way in resolving some of the problems between the subject and object split that has really just pathologized our understanding of our place in the world. And what I'm going to suggest is that this actually establishes a pretty solid theoretical basis for us to consider movement practice as one of the fundamental aspects of personal transformation. Now, how do we start to untangle this? My basis almost always is on the idea of us as an example of a cybernetic system. Now, a cybernetic system is essentially a goal-directed, feedback-driven, self-organizing process that engages in certain activities in relation to the world based on feedback that it picks up. So an action occurs, it senses the results of that action, it then uses that feedback to adjust how its continued behavior is going to go. And one of the things that a couple of authors have demonstrated recently, DeYoung and Kruger, they've made clear that we can start to understand psychopathology actually as a cybernetic dysfunction. And their model essentially argues that psychopathology is a persistent failure to adjust our goals, our representations, and our actions when these have proven unsuccessful. Now, what I find really interesting about this is that based on this model, they then make an argument that we can understand a cybernetic system as a system built around action. That is to say, any of these systems, you and I included, they take part in what we might schematize as a 5-step cycle. There's the activation of a goal. There's the selection of an action that could move toward that goal. There's the performance of an action itself. There is the interpretation of the results of that action. And then there's a comparison with the goal state. And they make the caveat that actually these things co-occur. It's not so easy to say that this happens and then this happens and then this happens. However, the exception is that action can be considered a bottleneck in the system because actions take place serially. So I can drink up a cup of coffee and I can say all of this stuff to you. And those things can occur in a series. However, if I attempt to drink a cup of coffee while saying all of this stuff to you, I'm going to run into problems. So given that actions tend to occur serially, we can consider this as the bottleneck in a cybernetic system. A cybernetic system, again, could be considered a cycle built around action, which would be the bottleneck. So this then begs the question, well, what exactly constitutes an action? What do we mean when we say action? Essentially, an action is anything that we do to maintain ourselves as we make our way through life, as we move toward particular goals. And I know that's not the most helpful distinction. I actually find that there's a little more effective way to think of this in terms of a movement practice given to us by the author Edward Reed. In his book, Encountering the World, he describes a series of action systems, including the orientative system that helps situate us in relation to the environment. There is the appetitive system that helps us regulate in terms of chemical processes, say taking in oxygen, expelling CO2, or taking in food and engaging in the process of metabolism. Those would be appetitive functions. Then we have things that we actually consider movements, let's say. We have all the actions of the manipulative system. That's where I take the world around me or pieces of it and I do things with it. I have a pencil, I write with it. I have a cup of coffee, I make the coffee, I pour it in there, I drink it. Manipulative actions are how I change the environment around me. Then I have the locomotive system, which is how I start to move myself through space in various ways. Then we have an interactive system where I start to engage with other agents in the environment. I talk to you, I talk to a friend, I pet the dog, all of these things. These could be interactions. And then Reid says there's a play system that kind of weaves its way throughout. And this is a little more complex, but especially for us being social and intelligent species, play is very important to our development. So we'll have more to say about that a little later on. But for the time being, let's say when we think about the actions that then start to organize a cybernetic system, they tend to fall in these categories. Now, these things, it's important to say, they don't occur in a vacuum. And this is where I want to circle back to that idea I introduced at the outset, the idea of an affordance. This is a concept developed by J.J. Gibson. And essentially, an affordance is an opportunity for behavior within an environment. So this is a way to get us out of the subject-object split. It's a way to get us out of deterministic cause and effect models, because an affordance doesn't cause a behavior necessarily. It occasions a behavior. It makes possible a behavior as an option, but an option that needn't be, let's say, actualized in that moment. Now, the other interesting thing about the notion of an affordance is that it depends on the relationship between the organism and the environment. That is to say, an affordance isn't found in the environment, and it isn't found in the organism. It's found somewhere in the relationship between the two. So it's very intimately related, both to what I am, questions of ontology, and what I know, questions of epistemology. That is to say, it is fundamentally a part of how I am, what I know to do in relation to the world around me. That then defines and begins to constitute this affordance space in which I'm situated. Now, let me make this very concrete. Let's say the floor affords me a place to sit. It also affords me a surface across which I could locomote. This mug, for instance, affords a grip. It also affords containment of a liquid, so that then I can pour my coffee in here, I can have my coffee, and carry on with my day. Now, this does not afford an ant the same things that it affords me. You can see that the affordance itself, the behaviors that this makes possible, depend in part upon what I am in relation to it. Now, also, this might not afford me the same behaviors across my lifespan. The infant, for instance, isn't going to have the same grip ability of this as I do if they haven't developed the fine motor skills, the dexterity. This also doesn't afford me much grip ability if I don't have limbs with which to grip it. So if I've been in an accident, or I'm at a stage in my development that behavior hasn't come into being as a possibility, the whole landscape around me changes in terms of the behaviors that are made possible in relation to that landscape. And this, I find, is really beautiful. It's one of the beautiful possibilities of the notion of affordances, in that it connects us to the world in a different way. It's almost as if the world begins to beckon us and invite possibilities for interaction. And so again, I find this personally very exciting. When we start to blur the subject-object distinction, we situate ourselves in the world in a very different way. We can come to experience ourselves in the world quite differently. And that in and of itself can be rather transformative. But I think we can take this even a little bit further regarding the notion of a movement practice as the basis for transformation. Because let's say that much of my sense of self, the way that I experience myself as an agent in the world, has to do with my opportunities for action. One of the ideas of agency developed by, I believe it was Eleanor Gibson, was the idea that agency is comprised of prospectivity, a kind of forward-lookingness, the goals that I set for myself, the sort of future that I wish to inhabit. It's informed by a retrospectivity, which is basically to say, how do I interpret the current situation in light of my historical experience. And it's defined by a flexibility of actions. So you can see that this links pretty closely together. It's a neat fit with the cybernetic idea of goals, representations, and actions. And again, the cybernetic idea says that I experience suffering, psychopathology, when I'm unable to adjust my goals, my representations, or my actions. We might then think in an ecological sense. I experience suffering when my sense of agency is disrupted, when I experience myself as not having a future, when I'm haunted by my past, when I'm unable to take action flexibly in the present to bring my dreams to fruition. I might suffer in all of these ways. So, with the idea that a cybernetic system is a system built around action, this, I think, really highlights the importance of movement in the process of personal transformation. And it's important to know that movement isn't created equal. Activity isn't created equal. On the one hand, there is the performance of an activity. I go and I do the things that I know how to do. And assuming that actually doing those things is moving me nearer to my goals, well, then I'm fine. I don't experience any disruption in my agency. I don't experience a cybernetic dysfunction, a failure to move toward my goals. But what then happens if the actions that I habitually take part in aren't moving me toward what matters to me? Well, then we introduce this other domain of action, and that's exploratory action. And Edward Reed makes this distinction between performative actions and exploratory actions. Typically, when we know what to do and how to do it, we're performing that activity. But if we don't know what to do, or we don't know how to do it, that's the value of exploratory action. It helps me develop my skill by voluntarily encountering the unknown and beginning then to domesticate the unknown and turn it into a reliable skill that I could then exploit. I could then make use of that skill to adjust my relationship with my environment to move toward the goals that matter. So, what then does that suggest in terms of movement as a basis for personal transformation? I think that what it suggests is that this exploratory activity plays a pivotal role in the adjustment of ourselves as a cybernetic system. If, again, cybernetics is a cycle built around action as the possible bottleneck, what we then have an idea is that our actions can inform, well, our actions do then inform our perception, the goals that we set for ourselves, our sense of agency. I could unpack that a bit more, but I don't want to lose this thread of the exploratory activity just yet. So hopefully you can remind me. I'll circle back to it. So with this exploratory activity, there's a fundamental idea that it costs a bit less in terms of our energetic resources, and it's not so focused on the outcome itself. Again, the outcome orientation is a little more characteristic of performative activity. This is the activity that we exploit to bring about a known outcome. However, if we don't know what we don't know, and we're engaged in exploration, we have to take a little more of a process orientation. And this, I think, can be one of the real values of a movement practice. When we engage in a sensory motor exploration, when we take part in novel movements, and we do so with attention, we do so with care for ourselves, we can bring about a very different experience of ourselves as a physical entity in relation to the world around us. I think, for instance, of a particular client I was working with who was struggling with chronic pain for the entirety of her adult life as a result of a car accident that led to a shattered femur, a broken ankle, all of this. Now you can imagine, for a person in such a situation, the sense of who they are in the world is incredibly constrained. It's hemmed in because there are so few possibilities for action. So her sense of agency was restricted because the flexibility of her action in the world was restricted. And as a result, the kind of future that she saw was available for her, well, that was restricted too. It's really important for us to keep in mind that our thoughts themselves are essentially projected actions. They're actions projected out in space and time. And so if we're unable to imagine ourselves as taking part in a given action, well, it's hard to think of that as being a part of the kind of future we're going to inhabit. So when I was working with this particular client, she mentioned, only after the fact, didn't come up before, but she mentioned after we had been working together for quite a while, that she had finally been able to put on her underwear by herself while standing up. And for her, that was this incredible revelatory kind of experience. It was an action that she takes part in every day, that for the entirety of her adult life had been constrained. She was unable to do it standing up because her balance was off, she wasn't strong enough, she couldn't coordinate the activity. So when she was able to do this, it's not just, oh, I can put on my underwear standing up. This reconstitutes an entirely different sense of self. This is the reconstruction of an affordance space that then develops a more flexible sense of self, a sense of self that is more competent, a sense of self that is more confident, a sense of self that is more effective in bringing about the kinds of goals that she might set for herself. And I use this as an example because it's something you and I and most people actually probably take for granted. But I think it really clearly exemplifies the fact that when our movement is constrained, our sense of self is constrained in the world. And so rather than engage in all sorts of psychologizing with her and having her work on her mindset and having her think better thoughts and having her develop a positive attitude, if we can simply make possible the opportunities for behavior that have been closed to her, all of a sudden, the psychological stuff sorts itself out all on its own, simply by bringing about conditions where she could learn what was needed, where she could start to explore how to develop the capacity to take part in these actions that had been constrained to her. All of a sudden, then, this sense of agency becomes much more flexible. All of a sudden, this cybernetic system gets the feedback that what she's doing is bringing about meaningful changes in her experience of life. That can create this positive feedback loop, this virtuous circle that then leads to taking part in more and more physical activity, going out for walks, going out for hikes, all of this, all of which creates demands on the system that lead to specific adaptations that result in her increasing capacity then to engage in other movements. And so you can see that if we can find some inroads here to create a change in how we act within the world, to make possible certain actions, this then opens up a field of possibility. It makes the world more inviting. The world begins to beckon us in different ways. And as we then take part in and we make use of these opportunities for action, we then can create the physiological adaptations that make more and more diverse actions even more feasible for us. So all of a sudden, we go from a world that is very tightly constrained to a world that occasions possibilities for action. We become more dynamically engaged in the world as we find more and more of our optimal grip, which again, I have to highlight, is comprised of how we imagine possibilities for action in the world around us. So I know that this is a whole lot of ideas, many of which may be new, many of which do have quite a bit of complexity to them. So if this brings up questions for you, feel free to drop them in the comments, let me know, anything like that. And if you'd like a little more support making possible more opportunities for action in your own life, if you'd like firsthand experience at how movement can drive personal transformation, I encourage you to check out workwithchandler.com. So again, if you have questions about this, feel free to drop them in the comments. Otherwise, I will look forward to being with you next time.